Chapter 1. The House That Never Slept. Scott Moore had never believed that silence was something you noticed only after it was gone. He learned otherwise the moment he stepped out of his car and realized he could already hear his backyard. Laughter rose over the fence in unbroken waves. Music pulsed, not obnoxiously loud, but loud enough that it threaded into his bones. Someone hooped near the pool. A bottle clinked. He stood in the driveway longer than necessary, keys still in his hand, tie loosened but not removed, briefcase heavy with the kind of exhaustion that was more mental than physical. Friday. Long week. All he wanted was his wife, a shower, and the couch they'd argued for 3 days over before buying because the showroom lighting had lied. Instead, he had apparently come home to a resort. Scott wasn't angry. That was the thing that made the sensation harder to name. Anger would have been easy, loud, self-righteous. But what he felt was quieter, heavier, like realizing you're standing in the wrong room during a party and no one has noticed because they weren't looking for you in the first place. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled like sunscreen, grilled meat, and the faint sweetness of alcohol mingled with citrus. The living room lights were on. Wet footprints tracked across the tile. Someone had left a towel draped over the back of a chair like they planned to come back for it. Scott closed the door behind him more gently than necessary. He reminded himself, again, that this was what they'd wanted. They had waited for this house. Years of saving, of passing on smaller options, of saying no to quick gratification in favor of a vision they shared. A ranch-style place just outside the city. Enough yard for a pool. A jacuzzi Crissy insisted would be an investment in happiness. A custom grill pit Scott designed himself because if they were going to do it, they were going to do it right. They had wanted to entertain. He set his briefcase down and went to the kitchen for water. The fridge was stocked for a crowd, not a couple. Plastic cups filled the counter. Someone had rearranged the island to make room for drinks. Scott paused with the refrigerator door open, listening to voices he recognized and many he didn't. Mostly Crissy's friends, as it had become. His friends had kids, responsibilities that came with schedules thicker than his patience. They came when they could. Scott had never resented that. Life moved forward whether you had a pool or not. He closed the fridge, took a long swallow of water, and braced himself. When he stepped onto the back patio, the noise increased all at once. Someone waved in his direction. Another voice called his name, cheerfully, as if they had been expecting him the whole time. Scott lifted a hand in acknowledgement, the expression on his face practiced and mild. Then he saw Crissy. She was sitting near the edge of the pool, feet dangling in the water, hair pulled into a loose bun that had unraveled the way it always did when she was relaxed. She laughed at something the man beside her said. The sound was genuine, unforced. The man, Aaron, he thought, though Scott had never cared enough to lock the name down, sat close enough that their shoulders brushed when she leaned back. Too close, Scott observed without emotion. Aaron said something else. Crissy touched his arm. Not a grab. Not lingering in any dramatic sense. Just long enough. Scott felt it click into place like a warning light on a dashboard you'd been ignoring because the car still drove fine. He didn't storm over. He didn't confront anyone. He simply walked toward them, kissed Crissy's cheek like he always did, and smiled. "Hey," she said. "You're home." "Yeah." His voice sounded normal. He was faintly impressed. "Long day." She tilted her head toward him. "Do you want a drink?" "No. I think I'm going to turn in early." Her expression softened. "Okay, I'll check on you later. I'm here if you need anything." There it was again. Present. Available. Just not to him. "Night," he said. "Night, babe." He went inside without another word. Upstairs, the bedroom vibrated faintly with music. Scott lay down anyway, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun, useless. The laughter filtered up like static. Every sound reminded him that his house was full and that he felt strangely absent from it. After nearly an hour of staring at the same shadow on the ceiling, he got up. He didn't leave a note. He didn't send a text. He grabbed his keys, slipped on his shoes, and walked out the same door he'd come through. 3 blocks. That was all it took to reclaim quiet. His sister answered the door in sweatpants and confusion. "Scott, are you okay?" "I just need a bed," he said. "I'm exhausted." She didn't ask questions. She hugged him, led him to the spare room, handed him a blanket like he was 16 and had had a bad day at school. "Sleep," she said. He did. Less than an hour later, she was back in her shoes. She let herself into his house with the key she'd been given and never had reason to use. The music was louder inside than she expected. The backyard looked like something between a block party and a mistake. She watched for a moment before stepping out. Crissy noticed her immediately and smiled. "I didn't know you were coming." Scott went to bed early, "but you're welcome to hang out." Scott's sister didn't smile back. "Are you sleeping with that man?" she asked, nodding subtly toward Aaron. The world didn't stop, but it staggered. Crissy's smile vanished. "What? No, of course not. Why would you even ask that?" "Because my brother is asleep in my spare room," she said evenly. "And from where I'm standing, you look very comfortable entertaining someone else in his house." Crissy opened her mouth, closed it. Fear crept into her chest, cold and sharp. I'm not cheating, she said again, quieter this time. I believe you, the sister said. But perception doesn't care what's true. Crissy followed her gaze to Aaron, to the ease, to the pattern she had never questioned until now. And suddenly, she couldn't unsee it. Chapter 2, Perception is a Petri dish. Crissy didn't remember sitting down. One moment she was standing in her own backyard with a paper cup sweating in her hand, and the next she was on a patio chair, knees pulled together, arms wrapped around herself as if the night had turned colder without telling anyone. Scott's sister hadn't raised her voice. That was the unsettling part. There had been no drama, no spectacle, no announcement to the crowd currently laughing at something near the grill. Just a question delivered plainly, followed by a statement that landed like a dropped plate in a quiet room. My brother is asleep in my spare room. Crissy's mind snagged on that detail and refused to move past it. He didn't say anything to me, she said, half to herself. He didn't, she trailed off, staring down at the water where her feet had been moments earlier. He just left. Scott's sister crossed her arms. Not defensively, protectively. That's how he handles things when he's trying not to blow them up. Crissy swallowed. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I didn't say you were, she replied. I said it looks wrong. Aaron cleared his throat beside them, shifting in his chair. Hey, I don't mean to intrude on. You already are, Scott's sister said without looking at him. Crissy flinched. This was spiraling too fast. The night had started carefree, almost mundane in its predictability. Someone had texted asking if they could swing by. That had turned into 3 people. Someone had brought drinks. Someone else had brought music. It always went that way. Easy, casual, harmless. At least that was how it had felt. Now every interaction rewound itself in her head with editorial commentary she hadn't had before. The timing. The way Aaron always seemed to appear when she sat down. How he didn't flirt outright, never crossed a clear boundary, but how he lingered just past politeness. The way she hadn't shut it down because nothing overt was happening. Because Scott trusted her. And because she trusted herself. Scott knows me, she said aloud now, as if saying it would plant it back in place. He knows I wouldn't. Intent doesn't immunize you from consequences, his sister said. Especially unintentional ones. Crissy pressed her lips together. That sounds unfair. It usually does, she replied. Aaron stood. I'm going to get another drink. That would be wise, Scott's sister said, dry. At someone else's house. He hesitated, looking at Crissy as if searching for backup. Crissy didn't look at him at all. When he was gone, the space beside her felt abruptly vacant. Not relieved exactly, just exposed. Why didn't he talk to me? Crissy asked quietly. Scott's sister softened then, just a fraction. Because you were having fun. And because he didn't want to be that guy. That guy, Crissy repeated. The phrase made something sour in her stomach. He's not jealous. No, she agreed. But he's observant. And he respects himself. Crissy exhaled. Hard. She looked around the backyard as if seeing it for the first time. The cluster of people near the pool. The brightness. The way the house hummed constantly now. Like silence was something that had been deliberately engineered out. How long has this been bothering him? She asked. Scott's sister considered her. Longer than you think. Shorter than it feels. Crissy nodded slowly. She thought about their early years together. Small apartment. Burnt dinners. Evenings that ended with their legs tangled on the couch because there was nowhere else to sit. Conversation hadn't competed with music then. They hadn't needed a guest list to justify staying up late. She stood abruptly. I need to find him. Scott's sister didn't stop her. Good. Crissy went inside, ignoring the questioning looks, the half-hearted attempts at conversation. She grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter and stared at Scott's name. No missed calls. No messages. She typed. Deleted. Typed again. Where are you? The reply came only after several breaths she hadn't realized she was holding. At my sister's. I needed sleep. Sleep. The simplest request in the world. And she'd somehow turned it into something he had to leave home to get. I didn't know, she typed. I swear I didn't. She stopped herself. That was an explanation dressed up like a defense. We need to talk, she sent instead. A pause. Tomorrow, he replied. I'm not angry, just tired. That phrase carried more weight than anger ever could. Crissy leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. Behind her, someone laughed. The sound grated now. She turned, clapped her hands sharply, and raised her voice. Okay, she said, forcing cheer she didn't feel. Party's winding down. A few people groaned. Someone protested. Someone else asked why. Because I say so, she replied. And because I actually live here. That earned her a few laughs, but people started gathering their things. Aaron reappeared with an uncertain smile. Everything okay? Crissy held his gaze for the first time that night. Really looked at him. No, she said honestly. And you should go. Oh, he blinked. Did I? Yes, she said before he could finish. Even if you don't know it. He left shortly after. When the yard finally emptied and the last cup was tossed, Crissy sat alone at the edge of the pool where she'd been earlier. The water was still warm. She dipped her fingers in and watched the ripples spread. Perception, she now understood, didn't need to be accurate to be powerful. And she had let hers get sloppy. Chapter 3. Safe Houses and Hard Truths. Scott woke up to the smell of coffee and the faint sound of someone moving around with the unnatural quiet of a person trying not to wake a guest who didn't ask to be one. He stared at the ceiling for a moment and let himself remember where he was. His sister's spare room hadn't changed since the last time he'd slept in it. Same pale blue walls. Same framed photo of the two of them as kids on the dresser. Him grinning like he'd just gotten away with something, her already wearing the expression of someone who knew he eventually wouldn't. The house was quiet. Blessedly, intentionally quiet. He sat up and rubbed his face, exhaustion still clinging to him but softened now, dulled at the edges by actual rest. He hadn't slept deeply, but he'd slept enough. More importantly, he'd slept without music bleeding through the walls and strangers laughing 6 feet from where he tried to shut his brain off. When he walked into the kitchen, his sister was leaning against the counter with a mug in her hand, scrolling through her phone. "You look less homicidal," she said without looking up. "I was never homicidal." "You were brooding," she replied. "Brooding can escalate." He poured himself coffee. "You didn't have to go over there." She finally looked at him. "Yes, I did." He didn't argue. There was no point. When his sister decided something needed doing, it generally did. They stood there for a moment in easy silence. It was a rhythm they developed early, two people who could share a space without filling it just to feel entitled to be there. "Did you scare her?" he asked. "She needed to be scared," she said plainly. "Not because she's doing something unforgivable. Because she's drifting." Scott took a sip. The coffee was good. Strong. Familiar. "I didn't want to accuse her of anything," he said. "I know. I'm not jealous. I know. I don't care what people think," he continued. She tilted her head. "You care when it becomes your problem. That's different. That's human," she said. "And you're allowed to say you don't like something without it becoming a trial of your character." Scott leaned against the counter opposite her. "That's the part one hate. The labels. You express discomfort and suddenly you're insecure, controlling, threatened. As if instincts are some kind of moral failure." She smiled faintly. "You've always been allergic to bad logic." He stopped, searching for the right phrasing. "I don't want third parties in my marriage. Not spectators. Not orbiters. Not people who think proximity equals permission. And you made that clear," she said. "Early, mutually, repeatedly." "Yes. And now it feels porous." Scott nodded. They didn't speak for a moment. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and stopped. Life moved forward at a reasonable volume. "I didn't leave to make a point," Scott said. "I left because I couldn't sleep. I didn't want to fight when I was already tired." "That was the right call," she said. "I also didn't want to say something I couldn't unsay." She shrugged. "You're going to say things today. Some of them might stick." "I know." He stared into his mug. "I don't think she's cheating on me." "Good. But I think she stopped noticing me being uncomfortable." "That's harder to argue," she replied. Scott exhaled. "I don't know when it happened. It was gradual. One party bleeds into the next. You tell yourself you're being ridiculous because nothing has technically happened. Then suddenly your home doesn't feel like one. That's the danger of technically," she said. "It kills context." He smiled despite himself. "You always were good at phrasing. You paid for it growing up." He laughed quietly. "I don't want to punish her. I don't want to lay down ultimatums. I just want our house back. I want my marriage back in the center." "And you're going to have to say that out loud," she said, "without making it about what she did wrong and instead about what you need." He nodded slowly. "She already texted me." "Of course she did. I told her we'd talk today." "Good." She reached out and squeezed his forearm. "For what it's worth, I don't think she realized how far it had gone." "I think that's the scariest part," he said. "How easy it was for both of us to let something important slide because everything looked fine from the outside." "Appearances are lazy," she replied. "They stop doing the work the moment you trust them." Scott straightened. "I'm going home." She smiled. "I figured." At the door, he paused. "Thank you." She waved him off. "I'll invoice you later." The drive back felt shorter than it had any right to. The house looked the same from the outside, neat lawn, freshly painted trim, the kind of place people commented on when they drove by. Inside, though, it felt different. Quieter. Cleaner. As if it were holding its breath. Crissy sat at the kitchen table. No music. No phone in her hand. Just a mug cooling between her palms like she hadn't thought to drink from it. She looked up the moment he walked in. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He didn't kiss her immediately. Not out of spite, out of intention. "I owe you a conversation," she said. "So do I." They sat across from each other, the space between them suddenly doing much more work than usual. "I didn't know," Crissy said quickly. "About how it felt. About how loud it had gotten. About him. I didn't see it until your sister said it out loud." "I believe you," Scott replied. She looked relieved and wounded at the same time. That doesn't make it better. No, he agreed. But it makes it fixable. She swallowed. I don't want our house to feel like it belongs to everyone. Neither do I. I don't want you to feel like a guest in your own life. His chest tightened. Then we can start there. They sat in silence again, but this time it felt intentional. Reclaimed. Chapter 4. The talk everyone avoided. They moved to the living room because the kitchen felt too exposed. Too many memories of laughter drifting in from the patio. Too many ghosts of cups and casual invitations. The couch faced the coffee table they'd assembled together one Sunday afternoon, arguing about alignment and laughing at the instructions like they were suggestions rather than rules. Scott sat at one end, elbows on his knees. Crissy took the other, folding her legs beneath her, hands tucked under her thighs as if she were trying to keep herself from interrupting. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was cautious. I don't want to start this with apologies, Scott said finally. Not because they aren't warranted. Just because they tend to rush us past understanding. Crissy nodded. Okay. I also don't want this to be a trial, he continued. There's no jury here. Just us. Her mouth trembled into something like a smile. That sounds like you. He glanced at her. Is that good? Yes, she said without hesitation. It's grounding. He took that in, then exhaled. I don't feel like I belong in my house anymore. The words landed softly, but they landed. Crissy closed her eyes. I'm so sorry. He held up a hand. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for space to explain. She nodded again, sharper this time. When we bought this place, he said, it was supposed to be a container for our life, not a replacement for it. Somewhere we hosted people because we were happy, not somewhere we hid inside hosting because we forgot how to be alone together. She swallowed. I didn't think we were hiding. I don't think you did, he said. I think it happened the way weeds do. Slowly, quietly, until suddenly everything else is crowded out. Crissy stared at the rug. I liked the energy, she said. I liked that people wanted to be here, that it felt alive. That makes sense, Scott said. It just stopped feeling alive for me. She looked up then. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I tried, he said gently. Just not with words. I pulled back. I went to bed early. I opted out. I told myself I was being dramatic. She winced. I thought you were just tired. I was, he said. But not in the way sleep fixes. They sat with that. I didn't think touching his arm meant anything, Crissy said quietly. It wasn't flirtation in my head. It was familiarity. I know, Scott replied. And I'm not here to litigate a touch. I'm telling you how it landed on me. She nodded, eyes glassy. When your sister asked me if I was cheating, it felt insane, offensive. And then it felt terrifying because I realized how little I'd considered what it might look like to someone who loved you. He softened. She can be blunt. She was doing her job, Crissy said. I just didn't realize I'd made it necessary. Scott leaned back, rubbing his neck. I don't want to manage someone else's access to you. I want you to do it because you see our marriage the way I do, as a private space we invite people into, not a public good. I do see it that way, she said quickly. I always have. Then we lost track, he said. Together. A beat. Crissy straightened. I want to make something clear. There was no emotional affair. No secret connection. No thrill. If anything, it was noise I didn't notice until it drowned out what mattered. I believe that, Scott said. And I don't want you to be the quiet one who disappears when something feels off, she added. I want you loud, early, unapologetic. A corner of his mouth lifted. Careful what you wish for. She laughed weakly. Deal. They shifted closer without discussing it. A mutual narrowing of the space that had felt so vast an hour earlier. Can I ask you something? Crissy said. Always. Did you think about leaving? Like, really leaving? He considered the question honestly. No. I thought about distance. About boundaries. About whether I could keep loving you while resenting the life we accidentally built. That scared me enough. She reached for his hand. This time, when she touched him, there was no ambiguity at all. I don't want to outsource my happiness, she said. Or our marriage. I don't need an audience to feel validated. He squeezed her fingers. I don't need you to give up hosting. I just need us to choose each other first. She nodded. We will. They leaned into each other then, foreheads touching, the house around them unusually still, as if it too were listening. Outside, the pool sat unused, water calm, waiting for an invitation that would be given intentionally next time. And for the first time in months, the couch felt like it remembered them. Chapter 5. Uninviting the orbit. Crissy expected it to be awkward. She hadn't expected it to feel surgical. By Saturday afternoon, she had cleaned the house with an intensity that bordered on spite. Not because it was dirty. Scott's definition of clean had always been methodical, but because she needed to do something with her hands while her mind worked through what she was about to undo. The patio furniture was arranged with intention instead of habit. No extra chairs dragged over just in case. No open invitation energy humming invisibly through the walls. The house looked like a place people lived again, not a destination. Scott watched her from the doorway as she wiped down the already spotless counter for the third time. "You know you don't have to host a summit," he said. "I'm not," she replied. "I'm re-establishing a baseline." He smiled. "That sounds ominous." It should. They had agreed, together, that she would speak to her friends first. Not because Scott demanded it, but because the imbalance had grown in the soil of her social circle, and she recognized now that she needed to tend to it herself. Boundaries, she was learning, were more believable when enforced by the person whose boundaries they were. By 4 o'clock, the first few people arrived. Familiar faces, comfortable energy. But something was different this time, subtle but real. Scott noticed it immediately. People asked instead of assuming, "Is this an okay time? Should we grab anything?" Crissy answered with warmth but also clarity. "No music today," she said cheerfully. "Just conversation." Someone joked that this was unlike her. She smiled and replied, "I'm evolving." The orbit showed up last. Aaron strolled in like he always had, casual confidence, beer already in hand like the invitation had been implicit. Crissy met him halfway across the patio. "Hey," he said. "I brought—" "This isn't a pool day," she said calmly. He blinked. "Oh, okay. And I need to talk to you for a minute." Scott didn't hover. That mattered. He trusted her to speak, and she trusted herself to be heard. They stepped a few feet away from the others, still within sight, but isolated enough that the conversation couldn't pretend to be private if it got loud. "I want to be clear," Crissy said, "about something I should have clarified earlier." Aaron smiled, a reflexive attempt at ease. "Sure. You've been very comfortable here," she continued. "Too comfortable." His smile flickered. "I thought we were all friends." "We are," she said. "But the access you've had to me, and to my space, needs to change." He tilted his head. "Did Scott put you up to this?" She felt the question land exactly where he'd aimed it, and recognized it as the misstep it was. "No," she replied evenly. "He trusted me to see it myself." Aaron scoffed softly. "Come on. Nothing's happened." "That's not the bar," she said. He leaned in slightly. "I never crossed a line." "You circled it," she replied. "Constantly. And I let you because it was easier than naming it." His tone hardened. "You're overreacting." Crissy smiled then. Not politely, but decisively. "No," she said. "I'm correcting." Silence stretched. "You don't get to speak to me the way my husband does," she added. "You don't get emotional proximity by default. And you definitely don't get to imply control where there is none." Scott glanced over just in time to see Aaron straighten, ego bruised. "So that's it?" he asked. "I'm being iced out because appearances matter more than intentions?" She didn't hesitate. "Because my marriage matters more than your access to me." Aaron stared at her, then laughed humorlessly. "Wow. Yes," she replied. "Wow." He left shortly after. No scene. No meltdown. Just a retreat that carried the faint sting of entitlement finally denied. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Someone commented on how calm it felt. Another joked that they liked this version better. Scott joined Crissy by the grill, handing her a drink. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she admitted. "But lighter." He brushed his thumb over her knuckle. That looked definitive. It needed to be. That evening, as the last guest left and the house settled back into itself, Scott and Crissy sat on the patio steps, shoulders touching. "You know what's funny?" she said. "What?" "I thought hosting meant generosity. But somewhere along the way, I confused generosity with availability." Scott nodded. "Availability without discretion is just exposure." She smiled at him. "I missed this. Talking like this." "I did too." The pool lights clicked off automatically, leaving the water dark and still. Inside, the house felt right-sized again. Not smaller. Just theirs. Chapter 6. Relearning quiet. The silence didn't rush in all at once. It arrived in pieces. First, the absence of music. Then the lack of distant laughter drifting through open windows. Eventually, the house settled into a low, familiar hum. The refrigerator, the faint tick of cooling pipes, the sound of two people existing without performing for anyone. Scott noticed it Sunday morning when he woke up before Crissy and didn't feel the reflexive urge to brace himself. No voices outside. No damp towels thrown over chairs. No sense that the day had already started without him. He lay there for a moment, watching sunlight creep across the ceiling, and realized this was the first morning in months where he felt present in his own body. In the kitchen, Crissy stood barefoot at the counter, hair unstyled, wearing one of his old t-shirts like it had always belonged to her. She was pouring coffee slowly, deliberately, the way people do when they aren't being interrupted. She smiled when she saw him. Morning. Morning. No preamble. No agenda. They sat at the table instead of the island. That felt important, though neither of them said it. The table was smaller, closer. It didn't encourage loitering or crowd control. It encouraged conversation. "I forgot how loud the house got," Crissy said after a sip. Scott raised an eyebrow. "Out of curiosity, Was that willful amnesia or survival? She laughed. A little of both. They talked about small things at first. A show they wanted to watch. A repair Scott had been meaning to handle in the garage. The kind of exchanges that used to make up their days before their calendar filled itself in without consulting them. At one point, Crissy leaned back and studied him. "What?" he asked. "You're lighter," she said. "Not happier. Clearer. I feel like I stopped holding my breath." She nodded. "Me too." The afternoon passed without plans. That should have felt wrong. Instead, it felt radical. They tried to read on opposite ends of the couch and ended up arguing lightly about who had stolen whose bookmark. Scott accused her of deliberately sabotaging him. Crissy accused him of being dramatic. "You alphabetized the spice rack," she reminded him. "That's structure, not drama." "You labeled it," she said. "For efficiency." She laughed and leaned against him anyway. Later, they went into the backyard. Not to host, not to prepare, but just to exist in it. The pool water shimmered quietly. The grill sat unused, its presence no longer a promise to others, but an option to themselves. Crissy dipped her toes in the water. "It's weird," she said. "I thought entertaining was how you used a house." Scott sat beside her. "Turns out it's just one setting. Like a feature." "Exactly." She smiled. "I think I left it on default." They talked about her friends. About how she hadn't realized how much social validation had crept into her sense of identity after the move. About how easy it was to mistake attention for connection. Scott listened without correcting, without rescuing. "I don't want us to drift again," she said quietly. "I don't want silence to mean distance." "It doesn't," he said. "Silence can be intentional. Distance is avoidance." She considered that. "Then we should schedule check-ins." He groaned. "Please don't make our marriage a quarterly review." She grinned. "Monthly?" "Never." They compromised on walking talks, which meant long neighborhood walks where phones stayed home and whatever needed saying got its turn naturally. It sounded simple. It felt revolutionary. That night, they cooked together for the first time in a while. Not because guests were coming, but because they were hungry. They burned the garlic slightly. Scott pretended it was intentional. Crissy threatened to revoke his spatula privileges. They ate at the table again. "This is good," Scott said. She smiled. "The food or the quiet?" "Yes." When they went to bed, the windows were open and it was only the sound of crickets and distant traffic that filled the air. Scott reached for her without thinking. She shifted closer without hesitation. As sleep settled in, the house held them gently. Not as a venue, not as a feature set, but as a witness to a marriage that had remembered itself. And for the first time since moving in, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Chapter 7, Hosting with Intention. The text arrived on Wednesday afternoon. "So, are you guys hosting this weekend?" Scott stared at his phone for a long beat before setting it down on the counter. Crissy noticed immediately. "That look means you're either calculating taxes or emotionally preparing for something." "Social taxes," he said. "Which are worse?" She read the message over his shoulder, then took the phone and typed a reply with her thumbs hovering deliberately before committing. "We are. Small. Intentional. 6 people. 2 hours." She set the phone down like she'd just sealed a contract. "That felt very formal," Scott said. "That's because boundaries sound stiff until people learn to lean on them," she replied. He smiled. "Who are the 6? "People who know how to knock," she said. "And leave." Saturday came with the kind of nervous excitement neither of them admitted to feeling. They didn't over-prep. Didn't stock like an invasion was imminent. They cooked one main dish together, prepped a single cooler, and left the music low enough that conversation didn't have to compete. When the first guests arrived, they knocked. Scott noticed that too. "Progress," he murmured. Crissy bumped her shoulder against his. Positive reinforcement. The energy was different almost immediately. People stayed grouped. Conversation flowed instead of splintered. When someone reached for the volume knob, they glanced at Crissy first. She shook her head gently. They got it. Midway through the evening, one friend laughed and said, "This feels calmer." Scott replied before Crissy could. "It turns out chaos is optional." That earned a chuckle and no pushback. When the 2-hour mark approached, Crissy stood and clapped once. "Last round," she said, smiling. "We love you. We also love bedtime." There were no groans, no pouting, just understanding. After the door closed behind the last guest, Scott leaned against it and exhaled. "That," he said, "felt incredible." Crissy kicked off her shoes. "I forgot how good it feels when people leave because we decided it was time." They stood in the quiet afterward, grinning like they'd pulled off something daring. "We did," Scott said. "Without an argument, without guilt, without anyone needing to lose." Crissy reached for his hand. "We hosted like adults." He laughed. "Don't say it again." Later, as they sat on the couch, just them, legs tangled, house humming softly, Crissy looked around and said, "I don't feel anxious in my own living room anymore." Scott pressed his forehead to hers. "Neither do I." Outside, the pool lights stayed off. Tomorrow could come whenever it wanted. Chapter 8. The house warming redone. They didn't call it a party. That distinction mattered. On the invitation Crissy designed, not a group text, not a casually forwarded message, but an actual invitation. She wrote, "A small gathering. Please arrive hungry, leave happy, and knock." Scott read it twice and grinned. "You made manners poetic." "I elevated expectations," she replied. Subtly. They invited 8 people. That was it. A mix of friends who knew both of them, not just her orbit, not just his old circle, but people who understood them as a unit. Scott's sister was included, of course, with a note at the bottom that read, "You can't critique unless asked." She responded with a single laughing emoji and a bottle of wine. The day of the gathering, Scott noticed something strange. He wasn't bracing. Instead of mentally running through escape routes and exhaustion scenarios, he was looking forward to it. The grill was already warm. Music played low and steady. Nothing about the house felt like it was revving up to consume him. Crissy noticed it too. "You're relaxed," she said as she handed him a plate of marinated vegetables. Suspiciously so. "I know the rules," he replied. "That changes everything." They had rules now, but not the rigid, punitive kind. Shared expectations. Unspoken agreements that had been spoken once and honored since. When guests arrived, the energy was intentional from the start. Shoes by the door without prompting. Greetings that included both of them instead of sliding toward whoever felt most available. Scott's sister pulled him aside near the grill. "This is different," she said, scanning the yard. "Healthier." He nodded. "Calmer." She smiled approvingly. "I'll allow it." Crissy watched them talk from across the yard and felt a warmth settle in her chest, gratitude without guilt attached. Later, someone asked about the pool. "Next time," Scott said easily. "Tonight's about food and conversation." And that was that. As the evening deepened, Scott found himself laughing in a way he hadn't realized he'd been suppressing. Not performative, not social mask laughter, but the kind that came from comfort. At one point, Crissy leaned close and whispered, "Are we hosting correctly?" He kissed her temple. "Perfectly." When the night wound down, people left gradually, naturally. No one lingered awkwardly. No one needed a push. The boundary was woven into the atmosphere now, inviting but finite. After the last goodbye, Scott locked the door and leaned back against it, eyes closed. "I like this version of us," he said. Crissy slipped her hands into his pockets and rested her forehead against his chest. "Me too." They stepped out onto the patio together. The pool lights reflected softly against the water, unused but not abandoned. The house stood quietly behind them, no longer asking to be borrowed, no longer echoing with expectations it didn't agree to carry. "This house is finally ours," Crissy said. Scott squeezed her close. "Always was. We just had to reclaim the deed." They stood there for a moment longer, wrapped in the quiet they'd earned, not by withdrawing from the world, but by choosing each other inside it. And when they went inside, the house followed suit, warming itself not with noise, not with crowds, but with intention.